In the year 1823, in a secluded village nestled among the wooded hills of Virginia, a heavy mist often clung to the cabins and fields. Life seemed uneventful here, measured by the rhythm of axes splitting wood, the slow hooves of horses, and the faint hymns drifting from the small wooden chapel. Yet that spring, something sinister crept into the air. Rumors spread like smoke. A child had begun to speak of things no child should know, visions of a violent death, of blood spilled long ago, of a murder no one dared to remember. It was unsettling enough to fracture the silence of this God-fearing community. If you love dark forgotten history, consider subscribing for more stories. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now in your part of the world? The boy's name was Nathaniel Harrow. At 7 years old, he was quiet, withdrawn, often sitting for hours on the porch as if staring into a world beyond the reach of others. His parents, simple farming folk, dismissed it at first as mere daydreaming, but as spring deepened, Nathaniel began whispering in the night. His words carried images of knives, of blood soaking into wooden floors, of a man whose face no one recognized. His mother would wake at night and find Nathaniel standing in the corner of the darkened room, his eyes wide open. In a trembling voice, he would murmur, "It wasn't supposed to end there. I remember the blade." She prayed fiercely and hid her terror from the neighbors. In a place like this, where superstition was a constant companion, a single rumor could turn a family into outcasts overnight. But children cannot be hidden forever. One May morning, as the villagers bartered cornmeal and salt in the small marketplace, Nathaniel suddenly froze, his gaze fixed on the faraway hills, and he spoke in a voice that was not his own. "That's where they buried him." I saw the blood sink into the floorboards. The marketplace fell silent. No one understood who him was, or what cabin the boy referred to. But the air turned cold, and no one could shake the chill. The words reached Reverend Thomas Wycliffe, a stern man who believed order was maintained through piety and fear. He warned Nathaniel's parents that the boy was under the influence of the devil, that only prayer and repentance could banish the visions. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Among the elders of the village, there were murmurs, faint recollections of a disappearance, an old tragedy spoken of in hushed tones decades before. Could it be that the boy was not cursed, but remembering something history had tried to erase weeks past? And Nathaniel's descriptions grew more precise. He spoke of a wooden cabin deep in the forest, with a rotting well behind it and a fireplace cracked down the middle. His details were too sharp, too certain for a child who had never left the village. Some of the older folk recalled that such a cabin had once existed, but they shuddered, unwilling to dwell on a memory their parents had buried in silence. One stormy night, Nathaniel woke screaming. His small body shook as he gasped out words between sobs. "He struck me with the axe. Again and again. I couldn't breathe. I still can't breathe." His father, a hardened man of the earth who believed in nothing beyond crops and seasons, avoided looking his son in the eyes after that. The whispers spread. At the well, in the chapel, in the fields everywhere, people spoke of the boy. Some said Nathaniel carried the spirit of a murdered soul. Others insisted he was possessed. But whatever he was, his presence unsettled the entire community. Stones began to strike the windows of his family's cabin at night. Curses were muttered from the shadows. The Harrows had become a family of dread. And yet, a few in the village paid closer attention. They noticed that whenever Nathaniel described the death, he shook with fear. But there was also something else. His eyes glimmered, as though he were remembering not his own pain, but the final moments of another man's life. He spoke of a pair of large, calloused hands, of a blade sticky with pine resin, of a scream swallowed by the earth. What chilled the villagers most was not just the boy's words, but the way some faces turned pale whenever they heard him speak. It was as if a buried truth, one the community had long conspired to forget, was being exhumed through the lips of a child. And in that year, 1823, Virginia's quiet hills would never know peace again. Nathaniel Harrow was no ordinary child, though at first glance one might think otherwise. His family lived in a modest log cabin on the outskirts of the Virginia village, sustained by cornfields, a small flock of chickens, and the relentless labor of his father. To outsiders, Nathaniel appeared pale, quiet, and withdrawn, a boy who preferred to linger at the edges of gatherings rather than play with others. Yet his silence carried a strange gravity, as if he bore the weight of memories too heavy for his 7 years. His father, Elias Harrow, tried to ignore it. "The boy is soft," he would mutter, shaking his head. "He spends too much time staring at shadows. What he needs is work, not indulgence." Elias believed the land was the cure for all weakness, and more than once he dragged Nathaniel into the fields, forcing the boy's small hands to grip the plow or lift stones far too heavy. But even in the broad daylight, with sweat dripping from his brow, Nathaniel's gaze often drifted not to the soil beneath him, but to some invisible place beyond. His mother, Abigail, was gentler. She noticed how Nathaniel's eyes widened at night, how he sometimes woke trembling as though he had been struck. She would cradle him, whispering psalms, trying to soothe him back to sleep. Yet she too began to feel the unease. One evening, as she bent over him, Nathaniel clutched her wrist with surprising strength. His voice dropped into a low, rasping tone, one that seemed far older than his years. "He's still out there," he said, staring at the ceiling. "The man with the axe. He's waiting for me again." Abigail recoiled. She knew her son had never seen such violence in his short life. There were no axes wielded in murder here, only tools for chopping wood, carving beams, or slaughtering animals. And yet, Nathaniel spoke with the conviction of someone who had felt the weight of steel against his bones. The Harrow family's neighbors soon began to whisper more openly. At first it was gossip, a boy with nightmares, a mother too protective, a father too stern. But when Nathaniel's words grew bolder, impossible to dismiss, the rumors thickened. In the churchyard, a farmer's wife told another she had heard Nathaniel speaking in a voice not his own. At the well, children teased him, calling him ghost-born and fleeing when he answered too quickly, too knowingly, about things beyond his years. The family's isolation grew. Men who once traded goods with Elias now avoided his door. Abigail found herself unwelcome at the communal wash, the other women's conversations halting whenever she drew near. Nathaniel himself seemed half aware of his effect on others. Sometimes he would sit apart during gatherings, watching the people with a kind of haunted calm, his small fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. When asked what he was doing, he answered simply, "Drawing the floorboards where I died." It was around this time that Nathaniel began to reveal names fragments that startled even those who had dismissed his tales. One evening, while staring into the fire, he whispered Jonas. His name was Jonas. Abigail, startled, asked, "Who? Nathaniel, who is Jonas?" The boy's lips trembled. "The man who struck me down. The man with the hands like stone." The name meant little to Abigail, but among the older villagers it rang like a bell. Jonas Kettering. He had lived on the outskirts nearly 30 years before, when many of the current townsfolk were still children. A surly man, known for his temper and for disappearing into the woods for days at a time, he had vanished suddenly, and though whispers had suggested foul play, no body had ever been found. In time, his name faded into the silence of forgotten scandals. Yet here was a boy, born decades later, speaking the name as though it had been etched into his very soul. Abigail confronted her husband, pleading with him to listen. Elias grew furious. "Do not feed the boy's madness," he barked. "You'll have the whole village turning against us. He speaks nonsense, and you treat it like gospel. Stop this. Abigail, stop it now." But even Elias could not shake the unease that stirred when Nathaniel's voice dropped into that uncanny register, filled with knowledge no 7-year-old could possess. The villagers began to gather in hushed circles after Sunday sermons, debating what should be done. Some insisted Nathaniel must be cleansed, that prayer and fasting could rid him of whatever spirit tormented him. Others whispered that perhaps God had chosen the boy as a vessel to reveal an old crime, and still others, the most fearful of all, muttered that such a child should be cast out entirely before the devil's hand spread further misfortune across the land. Nathaniel himself seemed caught between two worlds. By day, he sometimes laughed and played with sticks, chasing chickens through the yard as if he were only a boy. But by night, the darkness swallowed him. He would sit upright in bed, eyes wide, speaking of firelight and screaming, of a cabin that smelled of damp earth and iron. His words wove a picture that grew more vivid with each passing week. He described floorboards blackened with blood, a hearth crumbling with age, and a well choked with stones. What terrified Abigail most was not only the precision of his descriptions, but the pain in his voice. When he spoke, it was not like a child repeating a tale, it was like a man reliving his final breaths. By midsummer, Nathaniel's reputation had become the central unease of the entire community. Men avoided walking past the Harrow cabin at night. Women whispered that crops near the family's land grew stunted, as though cursed. The local children crossed themselves when Nathaniel passed, muttering prayers under their breath. And yet, despite the fear, curiosity gnawed at them. Could it be true? Could a boy carry the soul of someone wronged, someone murdered long ago? And if so, what did it mean for them that their quiet Virginia hills might be haunted not by spirits floating in the night, but by the reborn voices of the dead? Demanding to be heard again, Nathaniel never answered these questions directly. Instead, on a humid July evening, he stood at the edge of the village, gazing toward the forest. Without turning, he whispered to his mother, "I know where it is. I can show you the cabin." The words left Abigail trembling. The villagers who overheard them grew pale, and though some dismissed it as childish fantasy, others felt the stirrings of dread. Because deep within the woods lay places that had been abandoned for good reason. Places where silence lingered too heavily, and where memory had already tried once to bury the truth. Nathaniel's declaration that he could lead someone to the cabin spread through the village like a sickness. For days afterward, no one spoke of anything else. In the market, men sharpened their knives more loudly than necessary, trying to mask their unease. At the well, women bent low over their buckets, whispering, "Did you hear the Harrow boy says he knows where it stands?" The forgotten place, the cabin, children, braver in their mockery than the adults in their caution, began daring one another to ask Nathaniel about it, though most fled before getting close enough. Abigail tried to silence her son, but it was futile. He spoke not with the hesitance of fantasy, but with the clarity of memory. "There's a path," he said one evening as fireflies blinked in the fields. "It bends near the river, then climbs toward the ridge. That's where the cabin waits. The well is behind it. The stones are covered in moss now." His eyes glistened as he spoke, not in wonder, but in the quiet conviction of someone describing his own home. Elias, furious, forbade the boy from saying more. Yet, in his heart, the farmer could not erase his own knowledge that somewhere beyond the ridge had once stood a cabin long abandoned, a place that older villagers avoided. He had never spoken of it aloud, nor asked why his own father had always told him never to wander in that direction. The boy's words clawed at those buried warnings, dragging them into the light. At first, no one dared to follow Nathaniel, but curiosity gnawed stronger than fear. By late summer, a small group of villagers gathered at the edge of the woods, waiting for the boy. He came quietly, barefoot, his small hand gripping his mother's. His father followed behind, jaw clenched, his face pale with anger and shame. The forest swallowed them whole. The path was faint, overgrown with brush, but Nathaniel walked as if he had traveled it 100 times before. "Here," he murmured when the others hesitated. "It turns here." The rocks used to mark the way. The villagers glanced at one another uneasily. None of them had spoken of those stones for decades, yet the boy mentioned them as though recalling their precise place. Hours passed beneath the canopy of oak and pine. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. Then, as the trees thinned near a ridge, Nathaniel stopped. He pointed ahead. "There," he said, his voice hollow. "That's where I died." At first, the adults saw nothing but tangled brush, but as they drew closer, the shape emerged a ruin of timbers, collapsed but unmistakable. The remains of a cabin slumped against the earth, half swallowed by vines and moss. The chimney leaned precariously, cracked through the middle just as Nathaniel had described. Behind it, hidden among ferns, yawned the dark circle of a stone well. The villagers froze, some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. Abigail clutched her son, trembling. Elias stood rigid, staring at the ruin as though it accused him personally. And Nathaniel, he did not weep or shiver. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, his bare feet pressing into the damp earth. He touched the rotted doorway with his fingertips. The blood sank here. He whispered. It never washed away. The villagers exchanged horrified looks. "It could be coincidence," one man muttered. "A lucky guess. The boy's been fed stories." But another shook his head. "No one told him of this place. No one's spoken of it since I was a child." They ventured inside. The cabin's floor had long since collapsed, leaving a gaping pit of earth and rotted beams. Yet the air carried a strange heaviness, the smell of damp wood mixed with something metallic, something sour. The villagers shifted uneasily. Abigail held her son close, but Nathaniel's eyes darted to the ground. He knelt and touched the soil, as if greeting an old companion. "I remember," he murmured, "the sound of the axe, the crack in the hearth. I fell here." His hand pressed firmly against the earth, and I never got back up. Abigail sobbed. Elias swore under his breath, dragging the boy to his feet, but others were not so quick to dismiss it. One of the elders crouched, peering at the ground. There, beneath layers of soil and leaves, something pale jutted upward. At first, they thought it was stone, but as the dirt was brushed away, the shape grew clear, a fragment of bone. A silence fell so heavy it seemed to press the forest flat. The elder recoiled. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered. "There's something buried here." More villagers began to dig with their hands, pulling aside dirt and roots. Nathaniel watched, his face expressionless, as if he already knew what they would find. And soon they uncovered more fragments, the curve of a rib, the socket of a skull, teeth still clinging to the jawbone, the remains of a human being, long hidden beneath the cabin floor. The crowd staggered back, horror etched into every face. Some turned on Nathaniel, their eyes wide with fear. "He led us here," one woman hissed. "He knew where to find it." "How could he know unless he's part of it?" Others whispered, "No, he's the victim, the one who was killed here." The boy said nothing. He only stared at the bones with a mixture of sorrow and recognition, as though seeing a mirror of himself. That night, the villagers returned home shaken. They carried no bones with them, only dread. The discovery spread faster than any harvest rumor. In the chapel, Reverend Wycliffe thundered from the pulpit that the devil was among them, working through the child. "Cast out the darkness," he cried, "before it swallows us all." Yet even he could not deny that a truth had been unearthed, something long hidden, something the village had chosen to forget. Nathaniel slept that night with his eyes wide open, whispering into the shadows. Abigail swore she heard another voice answer him from the darkness low, "Broken, and not of this world." And the cabin, far out in the woods, waited silently, its floor torn open, its secrets crawling back into the light. The discovery of the ruined cabin and the bones buried beneath its floor sent ripples of fear through the entire community. Virginia villages in the early 19th century were no strangers to hardship sickness. Famine and death were constant companions. But what unsettled the people most was not the bones themselves, but the boy who had led them there. Nathaniel Harrow became both the center of dread and the vessel of a mystery no one dared to confront aloud. In the days that followed, the cabin lingered in every conversation. Men avoided mentioning it directly, yet their eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Women carried water with hurried steps, whispering behind cupped hands. Even the children, normally bold in their mockery, kept their distance, staring wide-eyed whenever Nathaniel passed, as if he were a ghost walking among the living. Abigail Harrow tried to shield her son from the village's fear, but she could not deny her own trembling. Each time Nathaniel spoke of the cabin, his words carried the weight of memory rather than imagination. "The chimney," he told her one evening, staring at the fire in their hearth, "it cracked when the axe came down. I remember looking up at it one last time." He spoke with the calm finality of a man recalling his own death. Elias, his father, grew harsher with each passing day. He refused to speak of the cabin, refused to acknowledge the bones. To him, the boy's visions were an embarrassment, a curse that threatened to ruin the family. "You'll bring ruin upon us all," Elias growled. "Keep his mouth shut, woman, or I'll see him sent away." Yet even Elias could not mask the unease that shadowed his eyes whenever Nathaniel muttered in that strange, aged tone. The villagers could not let the matter rest. A group of men, driven by grim curiosity, returned to the cabin with tools to dig deeper. They unearthed more than bones. Buried beneath the rotting timbers, they found rusted fragments of metal, a buckle, a bent blade, the remains of a boot. Enough to suggest the victim had once been a man of flesh and blood, not merely a forgotten tale. Yet no name could be tied to the remains. The dead lay nameless, a puzzle with only the boy's words to give it shape. Nathaniel seemed both drawn and repelled by the discovery. At times he would ask, in a hushed voice, "Did you bring him back with you? Did you leave him there alone at other times?" He would withdraw entirely, staring into nothing for hours. Abigail began to fear that her son was fading into that other self, the one who remembered dying beneath an axe. The villagers argued bitterly over what it meant. Some believed the boy was cursed, that Satan himself spoke through him. Others thought God was revealing an old crime, demanding justice even after decades. But there was no agreement, no peace. The community, once bound tightly by shared faith and survival, now found itself divided by fear. Reverend Wycliffe took the pulpit again, his voice echoing through the wooden chapel. "We are beset by lies and shadows," he thundered. "The devil wears the face of a child. He lures us with bones and whispers. Cast out the evil, or it will consume us." His words stirred many hearts, filling them with righteous anger. Yet, even among the faithful, doubt gnawed. If it was the devil, why had the bones been real? Why had the boy known where to find them? Nathaniel himself offered no comfort. On the Sunday following the sermon, He sat at the back of the chapel, silent, his eyes fixed on the wooden cross. When the congregation knelt to pray, Nathaniel whispered to his mother, "He was here once, sitting where I sit. He prayed before he died." Abigail nearly collapsed from the shock, for the boy's words came not in his own voice, but in the rasp of an older man. That evening, villagers began to speak of exorcism, a ritual, perhaps, to cleanse the child of his burden. Others whispered of harsher remedies of sending Nathaniel away. Or worse. Fear made people cruel, and the boy was fast becoming a symbol of something larger than himself. But amid the rising hysteria, a few sought answers. Among them was Thomas Reed, one of the oldest men in the village. He remembered, dimly, the whispers of his youth of a man named Jonas Kettering, who had lived on the ridge and vanished suddenly. Reed's memory was frail, yet the name gnawed at him. Could the bones belong to Kettering or to someone Kettering had wronged one evening? Reed visited the Harrow family. He sat heavily by the fire, his eyes fixed on Nathaniel. "Boy," he said, his voice shaking, "tell me, do you know the man's name, the one who struck you down?" Nathaniel's eyes darkened. His lips moved slowly, deliberately. Jonas. His name was Jonas. The old man paled. The fire cracked loudly, as though punctuating the revelation. Abigail gasped. Elias swore under his breath. For Reed. The name brought back buried fragments, stories his father had muttered. Warnings to never wander past the ridge. Jonas Kettering had been a cruel man, feared by neighbors, prone to rage. His disappearance had never been explained. Now, decades later, a child spoke his name with uncanny certainty. The revelation spread swiftly. Some took it as proof of Nathaniel's truth that he carried the memory of a murder victim, demanding justice from beyond the grave. Others grew even more fearful, insisting that no child could recall such things unless possessed by unholy forces. The cabin became a forbidden place once more. No one dared return after dark. Hunters avoided the ridge. Mothers warned their children to stay close to the village. Yet Nathaniel seemed bound to it, as though part of him still lingered among the rotting timbers and silent stones. Abigail began to dream of the cabin herself, of firelight flickering across broken floorboards, of blood soaking into the earth. She would wake drenched in sweat, Nathaniel staring at her as though he had shared the dream. The line between her son and the nameless dead blurred, until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The villagers lived in uneasy silence, caught between fear and fascination. But the truth, once unearthed, could not be buried again. Nathaniel had named the killer. And with that name came questions too dangerous to ignore. They called it the place where the story bled through, the ruined cabin, the bones beneath the floor. And the boy who spoke as if breath were a bridge between two lives, these were no longer gossip, but a gravity that pulled the entire village into its dark orbit. Yet, what emerged next were not answers, only fragments, shards of a murder glinting in the half-light, each piece sharp, each piece incomplete. On the second morning after the discovery, a handful of men returned to the site with shovels, iron hooks, and a coil of rope. Nathaniel did not ask to go, he simply followed, moving with the wary obedience of a sleepwalker. Abigail walked beside him. Her fingers laced around his wrist. Elias trailed behind, jaw tight, his silence brittle as glass. The forest smelled of damp bark and crushed fern. When they reached the clearing, the cabin hunched in the undergrowth like a wounded animal, its chimney split and leaning, its doorway yawning low. Nathaniel stepped over the threshold and stood in the hollow where the floor had collapsed. He did not look at the men or at his parents. He looked at the earth as if listening. "Fire first," he said softly. It was night. A murmur ran through the group. Thomas Reed crouched by the hearthstones. His thumb traced a ragged chip on the corner. "You said the chimney cracked when the axe came down." Nathaniel nodded once. He missed the first swing. "Hit stone." It threw sparks. He spoke without drama, each detail measured, as if reading a ledger no one else could see. They dug carefully. The soil within the cabin was heavy and dark, and at a shallow depth they found a scattering of objects, a bent iron nail, a buckle snapped at the prong, a smear of something brown embedded in wood that smelled faintly metallic when scraped. One of the men swore it was old blood. Another scoffed that time turns everything to stain. They argued because argument felt safer than belief. Nathaniel walked a slow circle around the pit. "There was a lantern," he said. The glass went first. He knocked it from the table. It rolled toward the door. He paused. He tripped over it when he dragged the body. "Whose body?" Elias demanded, the words striking like a lash. The boy's gaze did not rise. "Mine," he said. "The one I was." Then a silence fell so taut it seemed the trees themselves were listening. Abigail's hand tightened around her son's wrist until he flinched. Reed swallowed hard. "Boy," he said gently, "tell us what you remember. One thing at a time." Nathaniel obeyed. The story came in fragments, an argument about money or debt, a voice that shook with anger, a hand closing on a shoulder. He remembered the smell of pine resin on the axe handle, the stickiness of it against skin. He remembered the taste of smoke and the sudden hush after the blow, as if the air itself withdrew. He remembered falling. The splinter of wood pressed to his cheek, the ceiling beams turning to narrow, distant ribs. He remembered the sound of his own breathing failing, and then the drag his body pulled into a darkness under the boards. Stones placed over his chest like a second weight of earth. "Why here?" one of the men whispered. "Why bury a man under his own floor?" No one answered. Nathaniel only lifted a finger and pointed to the corner where the soil sloped toward the hearth. "Because the ground was already loosened there," he said. "He kept a pit to store winter potatoes. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. They widened the excavation. A rusted hinge surfaced, jagged along one edge as if broken by force. Beneath it lay a narrow strip of fabric, too rotted to identify, and a thin leather cord knotted twice the kind used to bind a satchel or a small ledger book." Reed turned the cord over in his palm thoughtfully. "Records?" he murmured. "Or money?" The possibility hung in the air like smoke. Nathaniel's voice thinned. He took something from my pockets. "A coin, maybe?" It rang when it fell on the stone. "What coin?" Elias asked, almost pleading for a detail that could tether this waking nightmare to the material world. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. I wasn't there anymore by then." Outside, at the back of the cabin, they cleared the ferns from the well. The stones were slick with age, the circle swallowed in moss. Reed lowered the hook and rope. When he hauled them up, the hook clattered against something hard. From the murky water they pulled a warped metal shape, the frame of a lantern, its glass long since shattered. A small shard remained wedged in the frame, opaque with lime and time, rolled toward the door. Reed whispered, almost to himself, recalling the boy's earlier words. Fragments accumulated: a lantern, a hinge, a cord, stains the color of rust, and yet the identity of the dead remained stubbornly blank. Too many years had passed. Teeth gave no name, bone held no letters. The story sharpened around its missing center, a life erased so thoroughly that only its ending survived. By midday, the men argued anew. Some insisted the boy's testimony was proof enough to march into town and summon a magistrate. Others warned that dragging the law into a tale built on visions would brand the whole village as fools. And if it wasn't, Vision, one man countered, voice low. If it was memory, but even he would not say the word reincarnation aloud. The idea moved among them like a chill draft felt. Denied, returned. Reverend Wycliffe arrived as the sun tipped past noon. He stood at the threshold with a Bible pressed to his chest and took in the scene, the pit, the bones, the boy. "This ends now," he said. "We do not feed the mouth of the abyss." He ordered the site sanctified. A prayer spoken over the remains. The earth resealed, the place abandoned to God's judgment. What the Lord allowed to be hidden, men should not exhume. Reed bristled. "With respect, Reverend, something wicked happened here. If there's a truth still reachable, don't we owe it to the dead to reach the dead owe us silence?" Wycliffe replied, "And the child owes his soul to heaven, not to graves." Nathaniel stared at the Reverend as if trying to recognize him from another angle. "He prayed," the boy said at last. "The night it happened. He sat where I stand and prayed." Wycliffe's lips thinned. Demons quote prayer as readily as scripture. He turned to Elias. "Take your son home. Keep him from this place." They filled the pit reluctantly. A handful of bones, wrapped in burlap, was reburied in a fresh hole beyond the doorway, marked with a stack of 3 flat stones. Reed laid the lantern frame beside them. "So the dead won't be in the dark," he muttered. The others pretended not to hear the tremor in his voice. As the men prepared to leave, Nathaniel lingered. He looked to the hearth and the chimney stones and then to the threshold where the dirt met the old sill. His expression was not fear. It was the searching sorrow of a traveler trying to recall a final landmark before the road disappears. "Jonas," he whispered suddenly. "He said that name, but I don't know if it was his." Reed turned. "You mean Jonas might have been the one in the ground?" Nathaniel did not answer. He only stared at the 3 flat stones that now marked the dead and touched his throat as if checking whether breath still lived there. The murder's outline had sharpened, but the faces within it had blurred. In place of clarity came possibility more dangerous, more enduring. The villagers went home divided and afraid, and in the deepening shade of the woods, the cabin settled into its old posture of waiting, as if certain that the fragments it had released were merely the first. The stones laid over the nameless remains should have marked an ending. Yet in truth they were only the beginning. A grave with no name is not a grave at all but a question, and questions spread through a village faster than plague. For weeks afterward, the people of Virginia's Hollow could not stop asking who the victim had been, who had swung the axe, and what role, if any, the Harrow boy truly played in the matter. Nathaniel carried the weight of it everywhere he went. To some, he was a prophet, a vessel chosen to reveal what time had concealed. To others, he was a curse in human form, the devil's own mouthpiece. Wherever he walked, eyes followed. Some faces softened in pity, others hardened in suspicion. But all agreed on one thing: there was something unearthly about the boy, something that refused to be explained away. At night, Abigail often found him standing barefoot in the yard, gazing toward the ridge where the cabin lay. The crickets sang around him, yet he seemed to hear another rhythm entirely. When she asked what he was doing, he would answer with words that chilled her marrow, listening for the rest of it. The part he didn't bury. The discovery of the bones had awakened something in Nathaniel. His descriptions grew sharper. His memory, or whatever it was, seemed to unfurl in fuller detail. He spoke of a night colder than most, of smoke crawling low across the cabin floor, of a voice shouting promises that turned to threats. "He begged me," Nathaniel whispered one evening, his eyes glassy, "begged me not to tell, but I did tell, and that's why he struck." Elias, who had once dismissed his son's words as childish madness, began to avoid him altogether. He left early for the fields and returned late, speaking little, his jaw clenched. There was shame in his silence. as though the boy's every word reflected a weakness in his own household. Abigail, torn between terror and compassion, clung to Nathaniel even as she wondered whether he was still truly her son. The village, meanwhile, became restless. Arguments erupted after sermons. One side demanded that the remains be left in peace, that the site be abandoned as Reverend Wycliffe commanded. The other, led quietly by Thomas Reed, insisted that the truth could not be sealed with stones. If Jonas Kettering was a murderer, Reed said, we must know it. And if he was the murdered, we must know that too. Silence is no longer safety. Silence is guilt. The name Jonas itself grew heavy on the villagers' tongues. Some remembered him as a cruel man who kept to himself. Others swore he had been seen in town on the very day he supposedly disappeared. A few whispered that he had not been alone in that cabin, that others had joined him, and that whatever happened had been meant to stay secret forever. The contradictions only deepened the unease, and all of it swirled back toward the child who spoke as though he had been there. One humid evening, the village council gathered in the chapel. The pews creaked under the weight of men with solemn faces, while women waited outside, straining to hear through the slats. Nathaniel, though uninvited, appeared at the doorway, his presence sending a shiver through the room. He stood silently until Reed beckoned him forward. "Boy," Reed said, his voice grave, "tell us what you saw that night. Tell us who swung the axe." Nathaniel's lips parted, but for a long moment no sound came. Then, in a voice not entirely his own, he spoke. I never saw his face, only his hands. They were broad, scarred, strong as oak. They smelled of tar. He called himself Jonas, but I don't know if that was truth or lie. A murmur rose from the men. Some nodded grimly, others scoffed. The Reverend stood, his Bible raised. "Do you not hear the devil in him? The boy confesses ignorance, yet cloaks it in riddles. This is not memory, it is deception. Cast him from this place before darkness spreads further." Abigail clutched her son protectively, tears brimming. Reed, however, stared hard at Nathaniel. "And what of the well? Boy, did you see what was thrown there?" Nathaniel shuddered. His gaze drifted to the rafters as though reading words etched into the wood. "Yes." He dropped the ledger first, then the satchel, then something smaller, a ring, gold with a crack through it. The men exchanged uneasy glances. No one had spoken of the cord and buckle found in the soil, yet the boy named them without hesitation. Reed pressed further. "Whose ring?" But Nathaniel shook his head violently, clutching his chest. "I can't. He'll come if I say it." Then his knees buckled, and Abigail caught him before he struck the floor. The council dissolved into chaos. Some cried for prayer, others for law, still others for silence. In the end, no decision was reached. The only certainty was that the village had stepped into something it could not easily leave. That night, as the storm rolled over the mountains, Abigail found Nathaniel whispering again in his sleep. His words were broken, but she caught fragments. The fire, the well, he promised it would stay hidden. She pressed her hands over her ears, yet the words seemed to seep through her skin, burrowing deep. The following morning, the well behind the cabin was found disturbed. Someone had gone there in the night, dragging stones aside, lowering a rope into the depths. At the bottom lay not only rusted metal, but scraps of leather, darkened with age. And something that gleamed faintly even through the muck, the curve of a gold band, cracked clean through. The villagers stared at it in silence. A ring without a name. A life without a face. A murder without a murderer. And Nathaniel, standing at the edge of the well, whispered, "He remembers me still." Fear, once sown, has a way of multiplying. The discovery of the cracked gold ring at the bottom of the well did not bring answers but sharpened suspicions. Every man in the village who wore such a band felt the weight of eyes upon him, and every woman who glanced at her husband's hand wondered silently whether she knew him at all. The object had no inscription, no mark to claim it, yet its very existence was proof that something once hidden still pressed against the surface, aching to be remembered. Nathaniel's presence in the village became unbearable to some. He had become a living reminder of secrets they wished left in the soil. Children were warned not to speak to him. Doors shut when he passed. And yet, despite the rejection, Nathaniel seemed less frightened than before. His voice, once hesitant, grew steadier when he spoke of the cabin and the night of violence. One evening, as the family sat in silence at their meager supper, Nathaniel laid his spoon down and said calmly, "It was not only Jonas." Abigail's breath caught. Elias slammed a fist to the table. "Enough of this," he roared. "You'll damn us all with your lies." But Nathaniel met his father's fury without flinching. There were two. The second held the lantern while Jonas raised the axe. His words chilled the room. Abigail whispered, "Who, Nathaniel? Who was the other?" But the boy shook his head, his face is blurred. "I see only his boots, worn, cracked at the heel. He stood behind me when the blow came. I heard him breathing. He said, 'It must be done.' The revelation tore through the village the next morning." If true, it meant a conspiracy, two men bound together in blood. Which of their fathers, uncles, or grandfathers might have carried such boots? The speculation gnawed at every hearth. No one dared accuse outright, but glances grew sharp. Conversations clipped, trust shattered like thin ice. Thomas Reed, driven by equal parts duty and dread, pressed the matter further. He sought out the Reverend, urging that the remains be examined by magistrates in the nearest town. "If law does not speak here, suspicion will eat us alive," he warned. But Reverend Wycliffe stood firm. The law of men cannot weigh visions. Only the law of God can banish demons. To bring officials is to invite ruin upon us all. Still, Reed would not yield. He visited the Harrow cabin by lantern light. Speaking with Abigail in hushed tones while Elias brooded outside, the boy's words matched too closely with what we found, Reed said. "Whether it is memory or possession, I cannot say. But truth lies in those woods, and I intend to find it." Abigail, exhausted from fear, clasped his hand. "And if the truth destroys us, then it was already waiting to be found," Reed replied. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's visions grew more vivid. At night he woke gasping, clutching his chest as though feeling the axe all over again. He spoke of being dragged, of cold stones pressed against his skin, of dirt filling his mouth. Sometimes, Abigail swore. She heard a second voice layered beneath his own, older, rougher, rasping through him like a ghost caught in his lungs. The boy's torment reached its peak one stormy night when thunder rattled the cabin walls. Nathaniel rose from bed and staggered into the yard, rain lashing his thin frame. Abigail rushed after him, calling his name, but he pointed toward the ridge. "He's there," Nathaniel cried. "He waits where the fire died. He wants me back." The next morning, villagers awoke to find crude symbols carved into the door of the chapel, circles and slashes that none could decipher. Some claimed they were witch marks, others that they were warnings from the dead. Fear thickened into anger. Murmurs began. "The boy brings curses. He draws evil to our doors." Elias, cornered by suspicion, demanded that Abigail stop shielding their son. "Let the Reverend take him," he said bitterly. "Better a son cleansed than a family ruined." Abigail refused, clutching Nathaniel to her chest. But the divide between husband and wife widened like a crack in the hearthstone. It was then that Reed made a bold choice. Gathering a handful of villagers he trusted, he announced he would return to the cabin one last time. "We will dig where we have not yet dug," he said. If there were two, perhaps more lies lie buried there. Against Wycliffe's protests, Reed and his companions carried torches into the forest. Nathaniel, unbidden, followed them once more. At the cabin, the night was still, the ruins looming like a crouched beast. Reed ordered the men to dig near the collapsed hearth. Hours passed as shovels bit into stubborn earth. Then came a hollow thud. Clearing the soil, they unearthed a wooden box, its boards rotted but intact. Inside lay scraps of parchment, water-stained but legible in places. The fragments spoke of debts, lists of names and amounts, tallies of livestock, promises of repayment, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, they found another object, a boot, cracked at the heel, just as Nathaniel had described. Gasps broke the silence. Some crossed themselves. Reed stared hard at the boy. "Nathaniel," he said, "does this tell you whose face was hidden?" Nathaniel trembled, his gaze fixed on the boot as if it glowed with terrible recognition. "Yes," he whispered at last. "I know now." But before he could speak the name, a scream split the night and one of the men collapsed, clutching his chest, his torch rolling into the weeds. Panic scattered the group. In the chaos, the box was dropped, its contents spilling into the mud. By the time order was restored, the parchment was ruined, the boot trampled. They returned to the village shaken and half-mad, carrying only fragments of a truth they could not prove. Nathaniel remained silent the whole way, his lips pressed tight, his eyes dark with knowledge he dared not share. And so the village lay divided between terror and suspicion, haunted not only by what had been found, but by what still remained buried in the boy's memory, an answer that refused to stay hidden, yet could never be spoken without shattering them all. The village was unraveling. Where once its people had lived in the rhythm of planting and harvest, now they lived in suspicion, their every glance weighed down by the possibility that one of their own had wielded the axe. The story of Jonas Kettering, long buried in whispers, now stood in the open like a wound that refused to close. But worse still was the shadow of the second man, a figure Nathaniel insisted had stood beside Jonas. Boots cracked at the heel, breathing heavily as the murder was done. Nathaniel no longer wandered the village freely. Some households barred their doors against him, muttering that he drew misfortune with every step. Others, though fewer, believed he carried the truth of a victim's soul and treated him like a living reliquary, too sacred and too dangerous to approach. For Abigail, the burden was unbearable. She watched her son grow thinner, pale from sleepless nights, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something only he could see. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Nathaniel startled his mother by speaking clearly. Without tremor or hesitation, it wasn't Jonas who buried me. It was the other man. Jonas swung the axe, but he left me on the floor. The other dragged me down. Abigail nearly dropped the ladle in her hand. Elias, overhearing, cursed under his breath. Enough. The boy lies, or worse, he serves the devil. He twists us against one another. He stormed from the cabin, leaving Abigail trembling with her son in her arms. Word of Nathaniel's new claim spread quickly. The men who had dug at the cabin grew restless, for they too had seen the boot, had felt the truth lurking at the edge of certainty. Was Jonas Kettering alone in guilt? Or had another, perhaps still living, shared his crime? The suspicion became unbearable. Thomas Reed pressed the matter in secret. He called together a few men he trusted, men whose families had lived in the hollow long enough to remember. If there were two, he whispered, one of them might have walked these roads under a different name, built a life here while the rest of us slept in ignorance. And if that's so, his blood still walks among us. The thought chilled even the most hardened farmers. Or if their neighbor, their kin, carried the stain of murder, then the village itself was cursed. And still, Nathaniel's words returned to them. more vivid with each telling. He described the second man's boots mud-crusted, cracked at the heel. He remembered a cough, deep and wet, that followed each breath. He remembered the man muttering scripture as he worked, though twisted, half wrong, as if mocking God. These details sparked rumors sharper than blades. Some claimed they remembered an elder with a chronic cough, long since buried. Others whispered of a carpenter whose boots had always been worn thin. Theories bloomed and withered, leaving only deeper mistrust. Families closed their shutters tight. Men eyed one another across the fields, and no one dared leave their home after dark. Abigail prayed ceaselessly for her son's peace, but Nathaniel's visions grew only darker. One night he woke screaming, clawing at his chest. "He won't let me rest," he cried. "He drags me down again and again. His hands are heavy, his voice never stops." She soothed him as best she could, but in her heart she wondered if Nathaniel's very soul was being consumed by the dead man's memories. The Reverend, seeing the village's unraveling, declared that Nathaniel must be separated from the community. "This child has become a vessel of confusion." Wycliffe thundered. "The devil speaks through him to divide us. If we allow it to continue, we will be torn apart." Some agreed and called for the boy to be sent away, perhaps to a distant monastery where holy men could cleanse him. But others feared that casting him out would only anger whatever spirit clung to him. Thomas Reed, though a man of faith, stood against the Reverend. "If we banish him, we banish the truth with him." Reed argued, "Would you rather live in peace built on lies than in fear built on justice?" His words split the council, leaving no resolution. That very night, as the argument simmered, the cabin in the woods seemed to reassert its presence. A glow was seen upon the ridge faint, flickering like firelight. A few men, daring each other, went to look. They found the ruins dark and cold, no sign of flame, yet the smell of smoke lingered heavy in the air. When Nathaniel heard of it, he whispered, "He's showing you what I saw. He doesn't want to be forgotten." The village grew frantic. Some wanted the ruins burned, the well filled with stone, the earth salted to keep memory from rising again. Others demanded the truth be dragged fully into the open, no matter how many graves must be disturbed. Abigail clung to her son, but even she began to feel the weight of dread pressing down. Then, on a rain-swept evening, Nathaniel revealed what none had dared to voice. "I know the other man's family. His blood is still here. That's why he won't leave me alone. He wants me to name them." The words struck like thunder. If true, the murderer's descendants lived among them still, carrying a legacy of violence unknown even to themselves. Suspicion turned inward, toward kin and neighbor. Whispers coiled through the dark like snakes whose boots bore cracks, whose cough echoed in the night, whose family line might trace back to a man who once stood with Jonas Kettering in a cabin of blood, but Nathaniel, pale and trembling, refused to speak the name. He pressed his lips tight, eyes glistening with tears. "If I say it," he whispered, "he will not just haunt me. He will come for all of us." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation, and the village, already fractured, teetered on the edge of ruin, knowing that truth was close enough to taste but too dreadful to swallow. By the autumn of 1823, the village was choking on suspicion. Once, its people had endured the harshness of weather, crop failure, and sickness with a grim unity. Now, unity had vanished. Every word spoken in the marketplace was weighted, every glance sharpened by fear. The Harrow boy had named no name, yet his refusal was worse than accusation. It left the whole village under a cloud of guilt. Abigail clung to Nathaniel as if her arms could shield him from the storm gathering outside their door. Elias, however, grew colder, convinced that his son had become a poison. He rarely spoke to the boy, and when he did, it was with bitter curses. The once proud farmer seemed hollowed by shame, and some whispered that he feared the truth. Nathaniel carried more than the villagers' judgment. Nathaniel, meanwhile, grew gaunter, paler. He ate little, slept less, and when he did sleep, his dreams spilled into the waking world. He described faces long dead, voices no one else could hear, and a night of fire and blood that replayed in endless cycles. The detail unnerved even those who had tried to dismiss him. "He's not inventing," Thomas Reed muttered to his wife one evening. "He's remembering." The Reverend Wycliffe seized on the growing unrest. Each sermon grew harsher, each warning louder. "The devil has taken root among us," he thundered, sweat glistening on his brow. "We are tested as Job was tested, and the child is the mouthpiece of hell itself. Cast him out, burn the cabin, fill the well until it never yawns again." His words stoked fury in many hearts, yet others still clung to doubt. For how could the devil's mouthpiece lead them to real bones, real artifacts, real fragments of a forgotten crime if the child lied? Why did the earth itself confirm him? The contradiction gnawed at the faithful until they felt torn in two. One stormy evening, Reed gathered a small circle of villagers in his home. The air reeked of damp wool and candle wax. "We must face it," he said. "The boy carries a truth that refuses to die." Jonas Kettering was part of it, yes, but the second man is the wound that festers still. If his bloodline remains here, we must know it. A blacksmith's wife trembled as she whispered, "If it is my kin, if the blood is mine," Reed's answer was grim. Then, better to know than to live in ignorance. Guilt stains us all if we let the silence continue. Yet, before any action could be taken, the village was shaken by a fresh horror. In the early hours of dawn, smoke was seen rising from the ridge. Men rushed into the woods and found the cabin in flames, though no lightning had struck. No ember had flown. The ruin that had survived decades now collapsed into ash, the well filled with smoldering debris. Whoever had set it alight had done so with intent to erase the past, to bury it once more under fire. Nathaniel, when told, fell to the ground as though struck. "He's angry," the boy gasped. "He knows I would have spoken. He's trying to silence me again." His thin frame shook violently, and Abigail held him as one would hold a dying man. The destruction of the cabin divided the people further. Some rejoiced, believing the source of their dread had been erased. Others feared it was proof that the guilty still walked among them, desperate to destroy evidence. Reed himself stared at the blackened stones with grim resolve. "Truth burns, but ash still testifies," he said. In the nights that followed, strange things were reported. The sound of coughing in the lanes, though no one was near. Boot prints in the mud, cracked at the heel, leading nowhere. Once, a farmer claimed he saw a figure standing at the edge of his field, broad-shouldered, unmoving, watching, but when he approached, it vanished into mist. The villagers, frightened beyond reason, pressed the Reverend for action. "Exorcise him," they demanded. "Drive the spirit out, cleanse the boy, or destroy him." Wycliffe, emboldened, declared a fast and a night of prayer, during which Nathaniel would be brought into the chapel and purged of his visions. Abigail resisted fiercely. "He is my son," she cried. "You will not harm him." But Elias, weary and broken, bowed his head. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps only fire can free him. His words cut her deeper than any knife. The night of the fast arrived. Candles filled the chapel, their flames flickering against the wood. The congregation gathered, faces drawn and pale. Nathaniel was led inside, his small body trembling, yet his eyes burned with strange intensity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You're calling him here." Reed tried to intervene, urging caution, but Wycliffe pressed forward. Psalms were shouted, prayers hurled into the air until the boy's voice rose above them all. It was not his own voice, but something deeper, rougher, like stone dragged across stone. "You cannot cleanse me," it growled. "You cannot bury me again, and I'm not gone." Screams erupted. Some fell to their knees. Others fled the chapel. Abigail clutched her son, but he writhed in her arms as though drowning. For a moment, all believed they were witnessing possession itself. Then, abruptly, Nathaniel collapsed. Silence fell heavy as the grave. His small chest heaved, and when his eyes opened, they were his own once more. In a faint voice, he spoke. I saw his face this time. The words froze the room. Abigail, weeping, begged him to say no more. But Nathaniel looked past her, straight at the gathered villagers, and whispered, "He is among you still. His blood sits in these pews." Panic surged. Accusations flew. Families turned on one another. The congregation shattered into chaos, and the chapel that once held them together became the crucible of their destruction. The boy had not spoken a name, but the knowledge that a name existed was enough to poison every bond of trust the village had left. The chapel never recovered from that night, and what should have been a place of prayer was left tainted by panic. Men avoided the pews as if the wood itself remembered. Women whispered of shadows in the rafters, of candle flames that flickered without wind. And the name unspoken but hovering in every throat became the most dangerous thing in the hollow. Nathaniel, weakened from the ordeal, lay in bed for days. His body seemed frail as parchment, but his eyes still carried that unnatural fire. Abigail nursed him with trembling hands, whispering psalms for strength. Elias, though, could not bear to remain under the same roof. He slept in the barn, muttering that the boy was no son of his, but a curse God had sent to punish him. The village fractured into two camps. Some demanded Nathaniel be cast out, abandoned to the woods. If his visions are true, they argued, then let him find rest among the dead he speaks for. Others, led by Thomas Reed, believed driving him away would only deepen the curse. "Truth cannot be exiled," Reed said. "It follows wherever silence once lived." But suspicion had already taken root too deeply. Each family examined its own history, wondering if the second man's blood ran in their veins. A cough heard in the night, a limp in a neighbor's walk. The sight of cracked leather boots, every detail became accusation. Violence simmered. Twice, men nearly came to blows in the marketplace. Once, a woman spat in her brother's face, declaring his children carried the murderer's mark. Nathaniel, fragile as he was, seemed strangely calm. He no longer fought his visions. Instead, he spoke in riddles, as though weaving fragments of two lives into one. "I walked this road before," he told Abigail one morning, "but I was older then. My back was bent, my hands were calloused. I had debts I could not pay, and they killed me for it." His voice broke, but then he added softly, "Yet part of him, part of the one who struck, remains here. That's why I returned." Abigail shivered. Who, Nathaniel? Who remains? But he only looked past her, toward the fields, where villagers moved like shadows against the horizon. The final breaking point came with a death. Old Thomas Reed was found collapsed near the ridge, his lantern still burning beside him. Some claimed it was his heart that failed. Others whispered darker things, that someone silenced him before he uncovered too much. The discovery of his body filled the hollow with dread. If Reed, the only man who dared to defend the boy openly, had fallen, then what hope remained for truth at his burial? Nathaniel stood pale and silent, Abigail gripping his hand. When the last spade of earth was thrown onto Reed's grave, the boy whispered. He tried to speak the name, but the ground swallowed him first. Abigail begged him to be quiet, but others overheard, and the whispers spread like fire. That night, the Harrow cabin was attacked. Stones shattered windows. Torches were thrown at the roof. Abigail shielded Nathaniel as Elias fought to douse the flames. Through the smoke, voices shouted, "Cast him out, cast him out." By dawn, the attackers were gone, but the message was clear: the village had reached the edge of madness. The Reverend seized the moment. "God will not forgive delay," he proclaimed. "The boy must be removed from among us." He proposed taking Nathaniel deep into the forest, leaving him at the ruins of the burned cabin and offering to silence whatever spirit clung to him. Abigail fell to her knees, begging mercy. "He is a child," she wept. "My child." But her cries found little sympathy. Elias, torn between shame and fear, did not lift a hand to stop the plan. On a cold October night, a group of villagers dragged Nathaniel from his bed. Abigail fought them until she was struck down. The boy did not resist. His eyes were calm, his voice steady. It was always meant to end there. They carried him to the ridge. The burned cabin lay in ruins, its stones blackened, its well filled with ash. They left him there, lantern light flickering across his thin face. Some prayed, others spat, all turned their backs. Abigail, bloodied but unbroken, tried to follow, but Elias held her fast. "If you go, they'll kill you too," he muttered. She screamed until her voice broke, yet the mob drowned her out. By dawn, the place was empty. No trace of Nathaniel remained, no body, no footprints, nothing. Only the stones of the cabin, silent and cold. Some said he wandered into the woods and perished. Others swore the earth had swallowed him, reunited him with the nameless dead. A few whispered that he would return in another form, in another child, until the truth was spoken aloud. The village never named the murderer. No one ever admitted to the second man's blood. The gold ring vanished, the boot was lost, the parchment rotted. But the memory lingered. For years after, mothers warned their children not to wander near the ridge. At night, the sound of coughing was still heard in the lanes, and more than one farmer swore he saw boot prints cracked at the heel appearing fresh in the mud. And though the village tried to move on, silence never brought peace. It only deepened the wound. For in the hollow of Virginia, the name remained unspoken, the murder unresolved, and the fear eternal.